The sun had only just begun to seep through the thin veil of clouds when Eli stepped out of the tent, stretching stiff shoulders and blinking into the pale Yosemite light. The campground was quiet at this hour, quiet in a way that made every bird call feel amplified, every rustle of wind sound like something alive and watching. Eli liked mornings like this. They made him feel as if the world hadn't yet decided what it wanted from him. Maren emerged a minute later, her hair tied in a loose, crooked knot she clearly hadn't bothered to fix. She shoved Eli lightly with her shoulder as she passed. "You look half dead," she teased, though there was warmth in her voice. "Coffee's going on the stove. Try not to fall over before it's ready." Eli smirked, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He kept glancing toward the tree line, as if something out there weighed on him. Maren didn't notice. Not yet. Her older brother, Kyle, was the only other one awake, rummaging in the food bin with the distracted energy of someone trying too hard to be responsible. He was 19, technically the adult in charge, though barely. "Today we do the meadow loop," Kyle said as he poured water into the pot. "Easy trail. Good photos. No complaints." Maren snapped a photo of him. "We'll complain if we want." But Eli stayed quiet. That uneasy flicker in his gaze lingered. Even when Maren shoved a steaming tin cup into his hands and said, "Come on, wake up," he barely managed a small smile. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and faint wood smoke. It should have been comforting, but something felt slightly off balance, like a chord tuned just a bit too tight. They packed slowly, laughing about the terrible camp pancake mix, joking about Kyle's inability to fold a map. Normal. Ordinary. But the forest seemed to lean closer around them, as if listening. When they finally started out toward the trailhead, Maren walked ahead, humming under her breath. Kyle followed behind, tapping through his phone, trying to get a signal. That left Eli walking in the middle, head lowered, boots scuffing softly against the dust. He felt the weight of unspoken things pressing against his ribs. He wished he could tell Maren. He wished he could tell anyone. But the words stayed locked inside. At the wooden sign marking the start of the meadow loop, Kyle paused. "You two go on ahead," he said. "I'll catch up after I check the map." Maren rolled her eyes, grabbed Eli's sleeve, and tugged him forward. "Come on. The day's not getting any longer." Eli let himself be pulled. The trees swallowed the path ahead, tall and shadowed, their branches threading together like fingers. The air cooled as they entered the deeper grove, and for a moment Eli felt a strange ripple along his spine, like crossing an unseen threshold. He didn't know why he looked back. He just did. Kyle was still visible, head bent over the crinkled map, completely unaware that this was the last moment he would see them on the trail, at least for the next 3 weeks. Eli turned away, following Maren into the green hush, and the forest closed behind them like a door. The forest sealed behind Maren and Eli as they walked deeper, the hush of morning settling over the trail like a held breath. Neither of them noticed how quickly Kyle's figure disappeared from view, swallowed by the twisting pines and uneven terrain. The shift was subtle, almost gentle, but it marked the first thread in a rope that would soon begin to unravel. Eli felt it more than understood it. The faint tightening in the air, the sense of something unseen adjusting its attention. They followed the trail for nearly an hour, talking about school stress, future plans, and the stupid inside jokes only the two of them remembered. Maren tried to coax Eli into opening up about the heaviness she sensed lingering around him, but he dodged with half-hearted humor. "I'm fine," he kept saying. "Just tired." Still, his gaze drifted again and again to the forest beyond the path, tracing shapes that weren't really there. By midday the light shifted, dimming as clouds gathered above the treetops. A thin breeze threaded through the branches. Maren paused, frowning. "Where's the trail marker?" She scanned the trees, expecting the familiar splash of orange paint on the next trunk. Nothing. Eli's stomach sank. "We didn't miss a turn. I was watching." His voice wavered, betraying doubt he didn't want to show. They walked back a few paces, retracing steps, but the path behind them looked unfamiliar, the dust disturbed by their own tracks in looping patterns that didn't match how they had walked. Something was wrong. Maren called Kyle's name, her voice sharp and echoing far too thinly through the woods. No response. She tried again, louder. The sound bounced strangely, swallowed fast by the dense underbrush. Eli's heart began to thud painfully, each beat echoing in his throat. "We should stay put," he said, though he didn't fully believe the idea was enough to fix anything. The forest felt different now, darker around the edges, as if the trees themselves leaned closer to listen. Hours passed. They continued searching for the main trail, spiraling outward in cautious circles, but the forest offered nothing familiar in return. The light dimmed further, pressing toward the early edges of evening. Marin's voice trembled as she snapped, "Kyle should have caught up by now." Her frustration cracked, revealing fear beneath it. Eli tried to stay composed, but the tension inside him snapped tight enough to hurt. He whispered, "We're lost, Marin. We need help." Back at the campground, Kyle returned to the trailhead, expecting to see them waiting impatiently. When he didn't, confusion turned to irritation, then dread. He walked the first quarter-mile calling their names, expecting laughter or a sarcastic reply from Marin. Instead, silence. His footsteps grew faster, more frantic. He found a single scuffed boot print near the edge of the trail, half-slid in loose dirt. One print. Not two. Not a pair walking side by side. Kyle radioed for help, voice cracking as he tried to remain steady for the rangers who arrived minutes later. Among them was Ava, her expression calm but concerned as she studied the ground. "We'll start a grid search," she said. But even she frowned at the abrupt way the tracks ended, as though the forest had simply taken them. As daylight drained away, Eli and Marin stumbled through the thickening shadows. The cold crept in first, then the realization that night in the wilderness was nothing like night at home. Somewhere in the distance, something moved. A snap of branches. A low, deliberate sound. Marin grabbed Eli's arm. And the forest became. Night didn't arrive gradually. It fell, sudden and absolute, as if someone had blown out a candle over the entire forest. One moment Eli and Marin could still see the outlines of trees around them. The next, everything collapsed into darkness. The snapping branch they'd heard moments earlier echoed in their minds, making every new sound feel sharper, closer, deliberate. Marin tightened her grip on Eli's arm. "Tell me that was a deer," she whispered. Eli swallowed hard. "Probably," he said, though the word barely held together. The forest at night did not sound like any forest they knew. It breathed differently, moved differently. The stillness felt too awake. Their phone batteries had died hours earlier, Eli's at 20% but useless without signal, Marin's drained completely. Kyle might already be searching. Or maybe he thought they'd wandered back to camp on their own. The thought twisted in Eli's stomach. "We need light," Marin said. Eli dug through his pack until he found the small flashlight he always carried. He clicked it on, and for a moment relief washed over them, until the beam flickered, sputtered, and dimmed to a weak halo. Low battery. Marin let out a thin, humorless laugh. Great. Perfect timing. They moved slowly, following what they hoped was the slope they had come from earlier. The flashlight caught on branches, roots, patches of dirt that all looked the same. Hours earlier, the forest had seemed inviting, full of possibility. Now every tree felt like a wall closing around them. A sudden gust of wind rattled leaves overhead. Both teens jumped. Marin exhaled shakily. "Eli, tell me the truth. Do you hear that?" Eli paused. The wind had died, but something else remained, a faint, rhythmic echo. Not quite a voice, not quite an animal call. A whimper, a cry. It pulsed through the trees like something trying to lure them closer. His chest tightened. It was the same sound he'd thought he'd heard earlier that afternoon. The one he'd pretended wasn't real. "I hear it," he admitted. Marin turned toward the sound. It could be someone hurt. A kid. Concern and fear warred in her eyes. Eli reached out, catching her wrist. "Marin, wait. What if it's not?" But before he could finish, the thin light from their flashlight flickered across the ground ahead. The slope beneath them gave way, sending both teens sliding downward in a rush of dirt, loose roots, and panic. Marin screamed as her hands scraped the earth. Eli's shoulder slammed against rock hard enough to make him gasp. They tumbled until the slope leveled out near the bed of a narrow ravine. The flashlight clattered nearby, miraculously still glowing weakly. Maren sat up, coughing, her hands trembling as she brushed dirt from her legs. "Are you hurt?" "Just bruised," Eli said. His heart thundered. The forest above them rose in jagged shadows, a wall they couldn't climb back in the dark. He retrieved the flashlight, aiming it along the ravine. The beam landed on something that made his throat tighten, a set of impressions in the dirt. Large. Deep. Not boots. Not deer hooves. Pause. Maren's breath hitched. "Tell me those aren't." "They might be old," Eli lied instantly. "Could be anything." But they both knew the shape too well. A big cat. A very big one. A low sound drifted from the ridge above them. A slow, deliberate scrape against rock, followed by the unmistakable hush of something stepping with intention. They froze, barely breathing. "Eli!" Maren whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't move," he whispered back. The flashlight flickered again, barely holding on. They crouched low under a fallen tree limb that formed a narrow shelter, hardly wide enough for both of them. Maren pressed close, shaking. Eli scanned the ridge with the dying beam. Something moved. Just a shadow, but wrong, too fluid, too silent. The sound came again. Closer this time. A growl. Soft, vibrating, unmistakable. The flashlight gave its final blink. Darkness swallowed them whole. And in that darkness, the ridge above shifted with the quiet weight of a hunter preparing to descend. The darkness felt alive after the flashlight died, thick, suffocating, crawling into every space where comfort used to be. Eli held his breath, ears straining for any hint of movement. Maren clung to his jacket sleeve, her fingers cold and rigid. For a long moment, nothing moved. No wind, no branches swaying, no rustle of small animals. Just that crushing, unnatural silence. Then the growl came again. Low. Drawn out. Close enough that Eli felt it vibrate through the fallen log they hid beneath. He pressed his forehead against the dirt. "Stay calm. Stay small. Don't make a sound." A heavy step landed on the ridge. Then another. Something large paced above them, claws scraping rock with slow, deliberate rhythm. Maren whispered, so quietly the sound barely existed. "Is it still there?" "Yeah," Eli breathed, barely forming the word. They stayed frozen as the animal prowled back and forth, its weight shifting with silent patience. Every instinct in Eli screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. No light, no path, only a steep wall they couldn't climb and a predator with the night itself on its side. Minutes passed like hours. At one point, Maren shuddered and Eli placed a steadying hand on her back. He didn't feel brave, but he needed her to believe they still had control over something, anything. A sudden rustle above them snapped his focus. The animal stopped pacing, sniffed. A deep inhale, like it was drawing the whole ravine into its lungs. It had scented them. The scrape of claws shifted direction, toward the slope leading down. Maren's breath hitched. "Eli. I know." The steps grew quieter as the creature moved, not because it was leaving, but because it was becoming stealthier. The kind of quiet meant for stalking. Eli felt the shift instinctively, his heart slamming against his ribs. He grabbed a loose rock beside him, gripping it tight even though he knew it was useless. Something slid down the slope, dirt, pebbles, dislodged by a careful paw. Maren clamped both hands over her mouth to stifle a sob. The cougar reached the bottom. They didn't see it, only heard the slow approach, the faint huff of breath, the soft pad of paws on damp earth. Eli imagined its silhouette, muscles coiled, tail twitching, eyes glowing with cold, predatory certainty. It stopped only a few feet from the fallen tree. Eli could feel its presence, heavy and focused. Another inhale. Another growl. Quiet, curious, hungry. Eli forced himself not to move, not to flinch. The fear inside him curled tightly, threatening to break him open, but he clung to the idea that stillness might save them. Maren trembled beside him, and he slid his hand to hers, squeezing hard enough to ground them both. For a moment, the animal seemed to consider whether the cramped shelter was worth the trouble. Its claws scraped the trunk once, twice, testing. The sound was soft but sharp enough to slice through their nerves. Then, unexpectedly, it stopped. A larger sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the forest. A distant call, sharp and echoing across the ravine. Another cougar? Or something else? The predator hesitated, ears shifting. Seconds later, it retreated. They listened as it climbed back up the slope, paws pushing gravel aside. The final step on the ridge felt like a door closing. Only after the forest settled again did Maren breathe out a sob, burying her face in her hands. Eli released the rock, his fingers numb. "We can't stay here," he whispered shakily. "We need somewhere safer. Somewhere it can't reach us." Maren nodded, wiping her cheeks with trembling fingers. "Where?" Eli looked toward the shadowed edges of the ravine, where boulders overlapped in jagged shapes. "There," he said. "Between the rocks. We'll find something." And as the cold deepened and fear clung to their skin, they began to crawl toward the darkness that would become their only refuge. The moment the last echo of the night's growl faded into the trees, Ryan forced himself to move. His heart still pounded from the encounter, each beat reminding him that he was alive only because whatever stalked him had chosen not to close the distance. Dawn seeped slowly into the forest, thin and gray, as if unsure whether it was safe to reveal itself. He gathered his gear with shaking hands, glancing often over his shoulder. Every broken branch looked like a claw. Every shadow, a watcher. The forest felt different now. Not just dangerous, but alert. It sensed him. It responded to him. The realization made the air heavier around his lungs. Ryan pushed north, following the faint stream he'd found the previous evening. The water's murmur grounded him, kept him moving even as fatigue pulled at his bones. He needed shelter, something more secure than an open patch of dirt beneath a half-dead pine. Whatever prowled last night wasn't wandering blindly. It knew the terrain. It knew how to hunt. Hours passed before the land finally shifted. The forest floor sloped downward into a narrow ravine, where boulders jutted like ancient, broken teeth. Between two of them lay a dark gap, partially hidden by a fallen spruce. Ryan paused at the entrance, one boot in shadow, one in the weak morning light. It wasn't just a gap. It was an opening. A shelter. Or a trap. He crouched, listening. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, more like a held breath. Still, it was cover, and he needed that more than comfort. He slid inside. The space was larger than he expected, big enough for him to stand if he hunched. Light seeped through cracks above, drawing faint silver lines across the stone walls. The air was cool but unmoving. Safe, he thought. At least for now. He set down his pack and examined the interior. Animal tracks, old ones, scattered near the back wall. Not clawed. Hoofed. Deer, maybe. Nothing predatory. He exhaled and allowed his shoulders to relax for the first time since the night had chased him awake. Ryan gathered branches, dragged them inside, and built a small barricade at the entrance. Not enough to stop anything truly strong, but enough to give him warning. Enough to buy a moment. As he worked, a strange sensation brushed the back of his neck, the undeniable feeling of being watched. He swung around. Nothing but stone and soft light. Still, the unease lingered. He needed a fire. The cave was dark, and darkness drew fear like blood drew teeth. But smoke could give him away. Firelight could reveal his hiding place. He struck the flint anyway. The spark caught quickly, flames blooming in a controlled, trembling circle. Shadows danced across the walls, long and bending, moving in ways the fire did not command. Ryan stared at them, unsettled. It felt as though the cave held stories, or warnings, or memories. As though it had seen this before. He couldn't shake the idea as he ate, as he rested, as the light outside dimmed again. He wasn't alone in these woods. He had accepted that. But inside this stone shelter, the truth sharpened into something colder. Something out there wanted him to stay alive. And something else wanted him afraid. Ryan tightened his grip on his knife, listening to the wind change. The second night was coming. Ryan didn't sleep. He drifted in and out of shallow consciousness, jolted awake each time a stone settled or a branch groaned outside the cave. When dawn finally crept across the opening, he felt as though he had aged years in a single night. The fire had burned low, leaving faint red embers that pulsed softly like a heartbeat. He stared at them, wondering whether the forest outside had been listening to each flicker, counting each breath he took. He packed slowly, forcing stiffness out of his limbs. The cave had offered shelter, yes, but it had also whispered a warning he couldn't quite interpret. Something had watched him. Something had waited. And when the wind changed last night, carrying that chilling, breath-like hush into the ravine, he felt sure the forest itself had leaned closer. When he stepped outside, the air felt thicker, as though he'd crossed into a different version of the woods, one that didn't bother hiding its intentions anymore. Ryan paused, scanning the trees. They felt closer. Not physically, but in presence. In attention. He moved uphill, careful with each step, listening for the usual rhythm of the wilderness. Birds, insects, rustling branches. But the forest had fallen into an unnatural quiet. Only the wind remained, threading through the treetops with a low, uneasy hum. As he followed the stream, Ryan noticed something he hadn't seen yesterday: marks carved into the bark of nearby pines. At first, he thought they were claw marks from some passing animal. But the slashes formed rough patterns, repeating shapes that seemed almost deliberate. Like warnings. Or boundaries. He traced one mark with his fingers, feeling how deeply the bark was gouged. Fresh. Not more than a day old. And there were dozens of them. The forest wasn't simply closing in. It was dividing itself. He pressed on, pace quickening. Midday light filtered through the canopy, but it didn't reach the ground in warm pools like it should have. Instead it broke apart, as if the branches above strained to keep the forest dim. Ryan kept checking his compass, but the needle twitched just enough to unsettle him. The stream, his one reliable guide, narrowed until it became little more than a ribbon of trickling water. He crouched beside it, cupping water in his hands, when something on the bank caught his eye. Tracks. Large, heavy tracks. Not boots. Not hooves. Paws. Whatever had made them walked upright for stretches, the prints too symmetrical to be a normal four-legged animal. Ryan's breath tightened. He followed the tracks with his eyes as they wound between the trees, until they simply vanished. As though the creature stepped forward and disappeared. A branch snapped behind him. Ryan spun, knife drawn, but saw only shifting shadows. The silence grew sharper, pressing into his eardrums. He backed away slowly, pulse pounding, until the forest around him began to blur into repeating shapes, each tree too similar to the last. He was being herded. That realization hit with the weight of falling stone. The forest wasn't trying to confuse him by accident, it was guiding him. Closing pathways. Narrowing his options. Steering him somewhere with patient intention. Somewhere he wouldn't choose on his own. Ryan forced himself to move, heart hammering, every sense screaming the same truth. The forest was tightening its grip. And soon he would learn why. Ryan lost track of the days at first. The forest didn't give him the luxury of marking time, not when every hour was spent fighting the same two enemies, hunger and fear. But eventually, as the stream thinned and the nights grew colder, he began to count each sunrise in the only way he could, by survival. One morning alive meant one more line in a ledger he wasn't sure he would ever show anyone. Food became a ghost he could barely remember. The few berries he found were bitter, barely enough to dull the ache twisting inside him. Once, he managed to flush out a rabbit, but it darted into a hollow log, leaving him panting in frustration. The hunger sharpened him, hollowed him, made every thought flicker with the same dull rhythm. Keep moving, don't stop, don't fade. But hope, thin, fragile, stubborn, kept flickering too. During the first week, he followed the stream relentlessly, believing it had to lead somewhere familiar. But it didn't. The landscape shifted subtly each day, like the forest rearranged itself while he slept. The claw-marked trees multiplied, forming strange spirals around clearings. At night, the silence deepened until he swore he could hear breathing in the branches above him. By the second week, exhaustion clawed at his mind. He tried climbing trees to scan the horizon, but every time the view showed only endless green, rolling and impenetrable. When dehydration hit him hard one morning, forcing him to kneel in the dirt, he whispered hoarsely, "Don't give up! Please don't give up!" The sound of his own voice startled him. It sounded small, cracked, almost unfamiliar. Still, he pushed on. Hope came in flickers. A scrap of faded fabric caught on a branch. A stretch of flattened grass that looked trampled by human feet. Once, he spotted what looked like smoke far off between the trees. He ran toward it until his vision blurred, but when he reached the ridge, nothing waited there but swirling mist. His mind began playing tricks on him. Some nights he thought he heard Emily's voice calling his name. Other times he swore he saw her silhouette ahead, disappearing just beyond the next rise. He chased these illusions until he understood they were only the forest echoing his desperation back at him. By the third week, Ryan's body felt barely connected to his will. His legs trembled constantly, and his ribs pressed sharply against his skin. Even breathing felt like work. He leaned on branches as he walked, muttering words he didn't fully hear. Yet something kept him going, an instinct deeper than logic, older than fear. And then, one late afternoon, he stumbled upon something that snapped the haze around him. A footprint. Not an animal's. Not distorted or half-sunk in mud. Human. Fresh. Someone else had been here. Maybe hours before. Maybe minutes. Ryan dropped to his knees, tracing the edges, fighting back tears that rose unexpectedly. He wasn't alone. Someone was out here. Someone alive. He followed the prints, adrenaline burning away the weakness for a few vital moments. The forest still pressed in around him, still guiding, still tightening, but now there was a thread to cling to. A direction. And for the first time in 21 days, hope didn't feel like a flicker. It felt like a pull. A pull toward whatever waited ahead. Ryan followed the footprints until the trail abruptly ended in a patch of churned soil. He crouched, breathing hard, staring at the abrupt disappearance. No turn, no fading pattern, nothing but disturbed earth as if whoever made them had simply vanished into the air. Cold unease slid through him. The forest had done this before, erasing paths, rearranging itself, but this felt different. This felt deliberate. He rose slowly, scanning the trees. That was when he saw them again. Claw marks. Not scattered or random this time, but aligned in a tight, curved formation along the trunks surrounding the clearing. Each mark slashed deep into the bark, long grooves carved with enormous force. Ryan approached one of the trees, pressing his palm against the gouge. The wood around the edges was still damp, freshly torn. Something had made these recently. Very recently. A tremor ran down his spine. He traced the arc of marks around the clearing and realized they formed a perimeter, encircling the spot where the human footprints ended. It was as though something had intercepted whoever was here, or whatever was here. His breath shortened. He forced himself to stay rational, to think like the Ryan who mapped trails, who read topography like a second language. But logic slid through his fingers. "Emily," he whispered, the name cracking in the air. The memory of her face flickered, fear in her eyes the last time he'd seen her. He clenched his fists. If these marks meant danger, they also meant direction. Something moved through these woods following a pattern, marking boundaries, creating zones. And if Ryan wanted to survive, he needed to understand them, not fear them. He walked the perimeter slowly, counting each gouge. They appeared at nearly perfect intervals, as if measured. No animal he knew behaved like this. The deeper he went into the forest, the more the marks multiplied, not just on the pines, but on oaks and cedars too. Some were higher than he could reach even if he jumped. Others sliced so low they nearly scraped the soil. He kept moving until the claw marks abruptly changed. In the dim light, he almost missed it, but one tree bore a different pattern, not long slashes, but crossed lines. A warning, maybe. Or a symbol. He stepped closer, heart thudding, and noticed something wedged in the bark's crevice, a fragment of fabric. His throat tightened. Blue. Emily's blue. The scrap was small, torn at the edges, but unmistakable. He held it between shaking fingers, pressing it to his face, inhaling mud, sap, and the faintest trace of something human. For a moment the world swam. She'd been here. She'd passed through this part of the forest. She wasn't just a memory chanting through the trees. She was real, alive somewhere ahead. But the claw marks framed the fabric like a grim message. They weren't random. They weren't accidents. They were signs, territorial, intentional, possibly even intelligent. The forest didn't just hold a creature. It held something that understood movement. Boundaries. Patterns. Traps. Ryan stood frozen as a low rustle swept through the branches overhead. Not wind. Something heavier. Slower. Watching. He tucked the fabric into his pocket, forcing air into his lungs. The forest wanted him to see the marks. To follow them. To understand the rules it was laying before him. And rules always led somewhere. He tightened his grip on his knife, eyes narrowing into the darkened undergrowth ahead. Whatever the claw marks meant, he was about to find out. The claw-mark trail led Ryan deeper into a narrowing corridor of trees, their trunks crowding so close he had to turn sideways to pass between them. The air grew still, damp, almost muffled, as though the forest were holding its breath. Every step sank into soft earth that seemed to swallow the sound of his boots. He kept one hand on the tree bark, steadying himself, using the gouges as signposts. They guided him downhill toward a darker patch of woods where the canopy thickened, choking out the remaining daylight. When he reached the bottom of the slope, he froze. A shelter stood before him. Hidden in a shallow depression between boulders, it looked like a crude, natural hut, branches woven together in tight, overlapping layers, reinforced with slabs of bark and stones. Moss covered most of it, giving it a camouflaged, ancient feel, as if it had grown there. The entrance was small, almost deliberately narrow, as though only someone desperate, or forced, would crawl inside. Ryan approached slowly, every instinct torn between hope and dread. He circled the structure first. No tools. No footprints. No signs of human construction. And yet the shelter was too intentional to be random. The branches interlocked like ribs. The stones formed a defensive wall. It was built for concealment and survival. Emily, he breathed, the name trembling out of him. Could she have made this? Could she have sheltered here? The scrap of blue fabric burned against his leg like a promise. He crouched near the entrance, listening. Nothing. No shifting. No breathing. No movement. But the air. It felt warm, as though the shelter retained the heat of someone who had recently been inside. His pulse hammered. He leaned closer and called softly, "Emily? Emily, are you there?" Only silence answered. He hesitated, for seconds that stretched endlessly, before pushing himself onto his elbows and crawling in. The narrow passage smelled of pine, damp earth, and something musky he couldn't quite identify. He moved forward until the passage widened into a small chamber barely tall enough to sit in. His heart cracked at the sight. A pile of leaves and shredded bark formed a makeshift bed. A stone bowl, crudely hollowed, sat beside it, holding the dried stains of water or broth. Broken twigs and gnawed pine cones lay scattered on the ground. Someone had lived here. Recently. Struggling. Surviving. Ryan gently touched the bedding. Still faintly warm. He swallowed hard as a tremor ran through him. She'd been here. Maybe hours ago. Maybe less. Then he noticed something that made the hair on the back of his neck lift. On the inner wall of the shelter, illuminated by the faint light filtering through the branches, were claw marks. Not deep like the ones in the trees, these were small, deliberate scratches. Lines and shapes forming a rough symbol. A circle. A slash through it. Another circle. A pattern repeating 3 times. A message. Or a warning. Ryan stared at it, unease coiling in his stomach. The marks weren't random and weren't human. But they had purpose. Meaning. Someone, something, had marked the inside of this shelter after Emily had been here. The shelter wasn't just built to hide. It was being watched. Suddenly, a faint exhale of wind passed through the entrance. Too steady, too warm, too close. Ryan's breath stalled. The shelter seemed to pulse around him, the woven branches shifting ever so slightly, as if responding to something outside. It felt alive. It felt like it was breathing. Ryan backed toward the entrance, pulse racing, every nerve sparking with one truth. Whatever had built this shelter might still be nearby. Ryan exploded out of the shelter on instinct alone, scrambling backward on hands and elbows until he was free of the narrow entrance. The forest air hit his lungs like a shock of cold water. He spun, knife drawn, expecting to see a shadow, an animal, a presence, or whatever had breathed warmth into that cramped space behind him. But the woods remained still, waiting, as though amused by his panic. His pulse thrashed against his ribs. The shelter loomed before him, deceptively quiet, the moss along its roof trembling slightly in the faint breeze. Ryan backed away another step, trying to separate fear from logic, but the line had long since blurred. After 3 weeks alone, surviving on scraps and instinct, the forest had gnawed away at the edges of his mind. Still, something had been there. Something warm. Something watching. He pressed a hand against his forehead, steadying his breath. He needed clarity. He needed direction. And above all, he needed Emily. He replayed the warmth of the bedding, the faint heat lingering in the air, the scrap of blue cloth in his pocket. She couldn't be far. But as he took his next step forward, his legs buckled beneath him. His knees slammed into the dirt, sending shards of pain through his spine. Hunger roared through him like a firestorm, hollowing out his chest. He gasped, fingers clawing at the ground as dizziness drowned his vision. The long weeks of starvation had finally caught up. He toppled sideways, cheek sinking into the forest floor. The scent of soil, pine, and faint decay blurred together. His arms trembled violently when he tried to push himself up, but his muscles refused him. He was slipping, into darkness, into surrender, into the quiet, cold acceptance that maybe he simply couldn't take another step. But then something moved. A whisper of footsteps, light, quick, purposeful, human. He forced his eyes open, vision wobbling. A figure approached through the trees, hesitant, scanning the area as though expecting danger. Sunlight caught the edges of a worn jacket. A backpack slung low. Messy hair. Dirt-smudged face. It wasn't Emily. It was a search and rescue volunteer. Or maybe a hiker. Or maybe, Ryan's mind fought to reconnect pieces he no longer trusted. The figure knelt beside him. "Hey, can you hear me?" the voice said, low and urgent. "You're okay. You're okay, I've got you." Ryan blinked slowly, trying to form words, but his throat produced only a cracked gasp. The stranger slid an arm under Ryan's shoulders, lifting him gently. The world tilted as his head rested against their chest. A water bottle was pressed to his lips. He swallowed too fast, choking, coughing, but the cool liquid revived him enough to cling to consciousness for a few more seconds. "I thought I saw movement," the voice continued, breathless. "Didn't think I'd actually find someone alive out here." Alive. The word struck him like a distant memory. Ryan forced his head up, voice raw. "Emily, she was here." The stranger froze. "There's another one? Another survivor?" Ryan nodded weakly, gripping the fabric in his pocket as if he could pass the truth through his fingertips. "The claw marks, the shelter, she's close." A shadow passed through the rescuer's expression. Fear, concern, disbelief. But they tightened their hold, pulling Ryan to his feet with slow, deliberate strength. "Then we're going to find her," they said. Ryan sagged against them, breathing raggedly as the forest shifted around them. The trees seemed to lean in, listening, waiting. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't alone. And now the forest wasn't guiding just him. It was watching both of them. The stranger supported Ryan carefully, one arm around his back, guiding him through the thickening trees. Every step felt like pulling his body through deep water. Slow, heavy, disorienting. The forest pressed around them, branches hanging low as though reluctant to make space. Even the air felt denser, thick with a strange expectation. Ryan could feel it in his bones. The woods didn't want them to leave. "Lean on me," the rescuer murmured. "We just need to get you to higher ground. There's a ridge north. Radio might get through." North. The word cut through Ryan's haze. Emily always used the northern ridge as her marker during hikes, claiming it felt safest. The memory steadied him, and he forced his legs to move, one faltering step at a time. His rescuer matched his pace, glancing over their shoulder every few seconds as if expecting something to emerge from the trees. After a long, dragging stretch of silence, Ryan whispered, "You saw the shelter?" The rescuer nodded once. "Didn't go in. It felt wrong." Their eyes flicked towards the direction they had come from. "Did you hear anything inside?" Ryan hesitated. The warmth. The breath. The shifting branches. "Yes," he said quietly. Something was there. The rescuer swallowed hard but didn't speak again. As they climbed the gradual slope, Ryan noticed something strange. The claw marks were thinning. Trees that had been slashed violently closer to the ravine now stood unscarred, untouched. The forest seemed softer here, the air lighter. Birdsong returned gradually, hesitantly, like nature was testing the boundaries of its own silence. "It's letting us through," Ryan murmured before he could stop himself. The rescuer stiffened. "What?" Ryan didn't explain. He wasn't sure he could. But every instinct told him the forest had shifted tone. Not welcoming, but releasing. Like a hand loosening its grip around a trapped animal. When they reached the ridge, Ryan's legs gave out again. The rescuer lowered him gently onto a patch of dry leaves. Wind swept through the clearing, cool and untamed, carrying no trace of the warm, suffocating breath that had followed him for weeks. For the first time in days, Ryan inhaled without feeling watched. Below the ridge, the trees rustled with restless agitation, as if sensing that something they had contained was slipping away. Ryan gripped the rescuer's sleeve. "Emily." "She went further north." "I know it." The stranger nodded. "Then we'll search north next. But first, radio." They unclipped a small emergency transmitter from their pack and extended the antenna. A faint crackle flickered through the speaker, weak but real. Ryan's heart lurched. The forest had blocked every signal until now. But here on the ridge, the static broke through in wavering pulses. "Base, this is Scout 8, the rescuer said urgently. "I've located a survivor. Adult male. Severely malnourished. He says there's another missing youth alive. Requesting immediate support at North Ridge Point." Silence. Then, through the static, "Copy, support, route." Ryan exhaled shakily, his vision blurring in relief. They'd done it. They'd broken through. The forest had loosened its hold. But then the ridge wind shifted, sweeping downward toward the darker tree line. The rescue worker paused mid-breath. From the place they had climbed, deep below, a low, guttural sound echoed up the slope, half growl, half exhale. Long, slow. Intentional. The forest wasn't finished with them yet. And Emily was still out there.